President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has said that Nigeria and Africa urgently require investments in alternative energy to fully and successfully transition to sustainable energy. President Tinubu made the remarks while speaking at a panel on African green industrialization on the sidelines of the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP28, in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. In his emphasis, Tinubu stated that Africa must not become a victim of the disruptions that come with climate change mitigation measures. Joining us now on the morning show as we review COP28 activities so far, holding in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, is Nnimmo Bassey, Executive Director, Health of Mother Earth Foundation. Good morning, Nnimmo Bassey. Good to have you on the morning show.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Well, President Tinubu is participating at COP28 in Dubai, and he has attended quite a number of meetings where he's encouraging investors to partner with Nigeria in the energy mix to have a sustainable, eco-friendly future. And he's also promised that Nigeria will end gas flaring. Are you very optimistic about some of the promises President Tinubu has made at this particular conference?
Well, yes, the conference has been an arena for a lot of promises, not just by the Nigerian government, but from all the various governments here. And this is quite disturbing because they've more or less turned the Conference of Parties to a scenario where statements are made and then people are left to believe that this will be translated into reality. And one thing that really concerns observers like us here is that the conference itself should be a serious negotiation platform. But this has been prefaced by a lot of business transactions in the back rooms, in the corridors, and everywhere. It's almost like a trade fair. Some of us call it a carbon trade fair. This is why we are quite concerned. We like the promises, we like the pledges. If the government can invest in renewable energy, that would be a big help for Nigerians, because certainly our national grid is not in a shape to take much increase in electricity supply, for example. But renewable energy could be done in a kind of discrete way that can be distributed in communities that are remote, and that would really make sense. The president also promised to get in 100 electric buses, and that sounded quite interesting. My hope is that they'll have the electricity to power the buses, and that we have roads to drive the buses on.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Bassey, for joining us this morning. One of the things that the president also spoke about was climate financing in terms of investment for this transition to happen. And I'm glad you talk about the fact that beyond being a talk shop, COP28, 27, previous meetings like this ought to have deliverables where we can see action. In the at COP27, where the delegation was led by the Minister of Environment, climate financing was also on the front burner. What difference has that made? Because if there was no difference between COP27 and now, what impact would this call for climate finance make with the president speaking?
The issue of climate finance has been a very complicated issue over the years, and it gets more complicated with time. At COP15, there was the promises were made by rich, industrialized, and polluting countries to contribute $10 billion every year up to 2020. Then from 2020, they pledged to contribute $100 billion to help vulnerable poor nations to cope with climate change impacts. Those targets were never met. And so here we are at COP28. The major highlight which came up from COP27 was the introduction of the loss and damage program. And now on the very first day of COP28, that was loss and damage facility was established, approved, endorsed. But in terms of many of our countries hoping to receive financial support, I think that is still a long way down the road to happen. Because you look at the loss and damage contributions. The United Arab Emirates pledged to contribute $100 million. Germany pledged $100 million. The US pledged less than $18 million. And everything came up to just about 400 million, not billion. But what is required by poor, vulnerable nations is about $4 billion every year. Now, the pledges on the ground for the loss and damage right now is just about 10% of what is needed. And so when our delegates, our nations believe that they can have deals that will bring real climate finance on the table, I think they have a lot of work to do. And this is what the negotiation should be about, actually discussing who would pay for what. And the historical responsibility of causing the climate change and the climate damage should not be overlooked. But again, this is what the powerful nations have said, that they would never treat loss and damage, for example, as reparation, which means if you don't treat it as reparation, then you're going to treat it like charity. And this would not cut the ice.
Okay, so a couple of months ago, we had sort of like a climate conference of this nature too in Kenya, where Dubai made, or the United Arab Emirates made some big pledge, to Africa as a continent. They've also led the way as regards this, but the biggest question is the fact that the biggest polluters are not doing anything. Likes of the Americas of this world, the Chinas of this world, and all of that. One, how can we get the big polluters to commit? Because they're always changing the bar, or they're always, changing the rules of the game midway when it suits them. The second question I'd like to ask is that transition energy, which is gas. We've not been able to harness gas. In fact, gas that's supposed to be a blessing has become a curse to us. What can we do as regards gas?
Well, you are very right in your analysis. Every subsequent years, the COPs have been backsliding from reality, from reaction that is needed. And this happened very spectacularly in the Paris Agreement itself, which is based on voluntary action by countries in what is known as the nationally determined contributions. Now, in terms of the transition to green energy, that transition is something that is going to happen whether we're ready or not. But I think the concern for us in Africa is whether that transition will be just. And there are many components to that. The Conference of Parties on Climate Change has not been very strong on the issue of justice. And this is why they played down the major plank of the framework itself, which is common but differentiated responsibilities and different differing capacities. This has almost been sidelined because now each country is behaving and doing what they feel is convenient for them to do. And this is why many countries are jumping on the platform, are ready to make pledges, because it's all about convenience. And we can't tackle global warming on convenience. There are those who have created this problem. There's a history behind it. We would know those who are impacted. There are poor, vulnerable nations in Africa, in Latin America, in Pacific Islands, in small island states. And the level of seriousness expected in terms of financing, in terms of shifting from dirty energy to clean energy, we are not really seeing it. In fact, in this particular COP28, it's a lot of the delegates are from the financial sector, and I know the drive for profit is what has created the problem. And then you have the oil corporations who are very well represented here, and then, of course, they want their technologies, they want their economic system to continue. So we make one step forward and many steps backward, and we don't really see the way that the kind of seriousness needed is being demonstrated here.
Okay, which leads me to the next question, which is again about optimism. Are you optimistic that the final COP28 agreement is likely to really talk about phasing out fossil fuel, oil and gas, or is going to talk about phasing down? Because that seems to be a major source of disagreement now, with the COP28 president, Sultan Jabbar, saying that there's no science proving that fossil fuel is responsible for climate crisis. Simply a case of climate denial on its part. And then you have 100 countries, as you mentioned, having signed up to say, well, it should be phased out. And Antonio Guterres also towing the same line. So even at this conference, there doesn't seem to be an emerging consensus on what should be done. Even UAE is increasing oil production.
Yes, indeed. This is a contradiction about the entire conference. We have an oil company boss being the president of a climate change conference. When he made a statement that there's no science to show that fossil fuels are the drivers of global warming, I think he was speaking as an oil company executive. Science has shown clearly that unless 80% of known reserves of fossil fuels are left untapped, are left in the oil wells, in the reserves, unless 80% of the known reserves, then the world has no chance of meeting the 1.5 degrees temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. So that is very clear. Science has shown this, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of Parties, COP28, is supposed to be driven on what the scientific panel tells them. And the scientific panel has said that if countries do what they said they're going to do, if they cut the emissions at the level they pledged to do, then the world is heading for 2.9 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. That would be setting the planet on fire. And the real reason why this is continuing to go is that countries and their corporations don't want to scale back on fossil fuel investments. Remember I mentioned is the known reserves, you can't burn all the known reserves. They're still looking for more reserves. New oil fields have been opened in Africa, in Uganda, in Botswana, Namibia, in Senegal. You know, we're finding a mad rush. And of course, there are many other things we can talk about the carbon finance itself, where Africa is being colonized, our lands are being taken, and our people are going to lose sovereignty over their territories, and others will be counting what they've done for climate change by citing what the carbon trees in Africa absorb, whereas the countries where these trees are standing would not. Once they've sold the carbon, they would not be able to claim them. So it's a whole lot of contradictions going on here, and I just hope that the delegates and negotiators would wake up to the reality that we are all humans and there are other beings on this planet and we have a right to survive.
Absolutely. We have a right to survive. And talking about the fact that the conversations must go towards the things you've mentioned, again, I'll come back to finance, because the president had said in 2022 that Nigeria as a nation, he wouldn't abide with the emissions policies if we don't get the funding to execute these policies and the transitions. He said that. And that's why, again, perhaps one of his position, Nigeria, in terms of our appearance at COP28, as mainly there, or primarily there for investment. He also positioned Nigeria as being ready and clean for investment. I'd like you to give an analysis of that. How much have we done as a nation to prepare ourselves, or perhaps to provide an enabling environment for investment in clean energy or transition to clean energy and tackling climate change? And also, is there a role that we ought to play, and how well have we played that role? Private and public, so private sector and also government.
Obviously, there will always be a role for the private sector. But this question you raised is what when I was coming to the COP venue this morning, I asked a party delegate from South Sudan, what is your major expectation from the conference? And he told me that they're hoping to attract finance so as to enable them make the transition. So I asked him, I said, how are you coming here to look for money when you have so much oil in South Sudan? Then he laughed and said, what of Nigeria? The sad thing is, the reality is that historically, we ought to require and receive needed financial support. But when we look at also how we've exposed ourselves to crass exploitation, in a country like Nigeria, we've not been able to say exactly how much oil is extracted on a daily basis. We are not able to, we are not very transparent about the finances from that sector. It's one of the most opaque sectors in economies in Africa. And so when we come to the Conference of Parties and then spend, like the big delegation from Nigeria, many of the agencies, the ministries, they will come in here, they'll be looking for projects, for finance. And then when you swarm the COP, if African delegates spend a lot of time looking for finance, By the time they get to the negotiation hall, their voices are already weakened. And we need to be able to go to these negotiations with a strong, strong voice and make very clear demands of what we need to support the work that we need to do. Until this is done, if we always come to the Conference of Parties asking for finance, asking for support, those who have the money are just not ready. Because they would rather spend their money doing something else. Just look at it. From the moment they promised to put $10 billion on the table, $100 billion on the table, this never happened. We need 400 for loss and damage. We have 400 million, not billion. But when it comes to, and it's not a problem of lack of finance in the world. Look at how much is being spent on warfare. The world, the rich countries spend about $2 trillion every year on armament and warfare. 2 trillion, not billions. And so it's not about money. It's about politics, about influence, about power. So we need to play our politics differently.
Okay. And it was a very good point you made, about how much you're spending on warfare. Look at what they spent in Ukraine. America alone, in aid and all of that, well over $10 billion, in the space of about a year. And the money keeps coming in, not also the other monies that have been spent. But when you look at it critically, Dr. Nnimmo wrote a very interesting piece about last year, where he talked about the hypocrisy and the fact that it's been politicized. And I'm sure you sounded off on that. I'd like to ask you, why are we honestly still going to COP when we know it's been politicized and it's already a jamboree? I mean, let's just cut to the chase and tell ourselves the truth of this matter. And maybe when we see the disaster that comes from the inconvenient truth, like, former Vice President Al Gore in America used to say, maybe that's when we'll know what we're up for. That's number one. Number two, when are we going to stop this hypocrisy of us going to the West cap in hand because we want to collect money from climate activities, when we can do a lot of carbon trading with our forests here that we are not looking at? I mean, look at countries like Gabon. The other day, they used their rich forest as a collateral for some green bonds that they got. When are we going to be able to use our forest as a form of investment here?
Actually, using forests as a collateral for carbon credits and for finance is not a good idea. And I'm saying this because the implication of corralling or fencing off forests physically or otherwise means displacement of local communities. We got communities in Kenya who have their communities sometimes set on fire. People have lost their lives. Communities in African countries, communities in Latin America, in Asia, whose territories are being earmarked for the mechanism called reducing emissions from forest degradation and deforestation. It is not really been, the actual money doesn't trickle down to the people who have been custodians of the forest and who have been defenders of the environment. The bulk of the money does not even go to the government. The bulk of the money goes to consultants who determine, according to them, how much carbon is in one tree. And the whole idea of designating a forest as a carbon, for carbon credits does not stop deforestation in those countries, because you mark out one forest for this mechanism, then the loggers move to the next forest. But, I know the main reason why this idea has flown so well is that it is something people have said, unless you put a price on nature, nobody's going to defend nature. But, we have to really go beyond that. We have to go beyond that, because we cannot place financial value on nature. Nature has intrinsic value, just like we have intrinsic value as humans. And we simply have to find new mechanisms of people knowing that the damage that's been done should be paid. And this is why the concept of climate debt has been developed by groups from the global south. There's a climate debt that's been accumulated over the centuries of exploitation, over the decades of exploitation, unmitigated the degradation. And this is what, if that is accepted, and this is what is being resisted by the powerful nations, if we accept that it's a climate debt, we will not be debating about climate finance. There will be sufficient funds on the table every year that would help those who are being impacted most to at least keep their head above water. So the other question you asked about, why do we always come to the COP when we see that everything is so hypocritical? This is a very good question. I asked myself that question. I've met pledges in the past about whether to come or not to come. But I personally, I'm not a negotiator, I'm from civil society, but I do believe that this is one of the best spaces for us to meet with all people from around the world, share stories, learn strategies, and also share ideas and work together. Ultimately, we need to have counter COPs, COPs of the people away from the conference halls. And that's where decisions could be made quickly and effectively. And to get politicians to implement what the people decide, we need the people taking back their sovereignty.
Well, thank you very much, Nnimmo Bassey. We seem to have run out of time. We would have loved to ask you whether you have seen the 1,411 Nigerians that are in Dubai. We asked Uveteme George earlier on. He said he hadn't seen anybody, at most of the events. Have you seen them? 1,411 Nigerians.
Well, I've seen that there are a lot of Nigerians around, and I actually, I've seen them, and some have very good ideas, and it's good. It's easier to meet them out here in Dubai than to meet them in Nigeria. So let them come. Send more of them to come. Thank you.
You want more? Anyway, thank you very much, Nnimmo Bassey, for joining us.